Guys, I'm John. It's nice to see you guys again. Um, Here's some announcements. We want to begin with a moment of silence to remember the lives lost this morning at the Basilica of Our Lady of Nice, France. Thank you. For All Souls Day Mass, we'll be having a 5 p.m. Mass with prayers after for the election. There will be no confession or Mass at noon that Monday. For Works of Mercy, we're going to be doing a diaper drive. From tomorrow the 30th to November 6th, we will have a box available at the chapel for pregnant mothers in need. Our Sunday night gathering will actually be a Sunday morning gathering as we will be on a hike. Join us at Bull Run Occoquan Trail at 9 a.m. and participants are responsible for their masks and transportation. The links will be down below. Starting next Thursday, November 5th, we will be having our Marian consecration using 33 days to morning glory. Daily reflections will be on YouTube and on Instagram. And yeah, can't wait to start this with you guys. From November 12th to 16th, we're going to be having a virtual auction. It'll be like an online eBay type silent auction. Items will be starting as low as $10. So invite your parents, neighbors, and even friends with that little cha-ching, you know what I mean? But I shouldn't have said that. This fundraiser is really important as it helps us raise money to put on events like these, have mass, and keep the chapel lights on. So consider making a one-time donation or bidding on a couple of items to help us out. The link will be down below. Of course, after TNS, we will be having our Thursday night compline at 9. And yeah, for our speaker tonight, a loving father, former cop, prodigal son, and of course, a soldier for Christ. Our speaker tonight is Jordan Burke. In this talk, he'll go over into exactly how and what that means, and how and what habitual sin means, and how to overcome it, especially porn, using neurology, psychology, and most importantly, the teachings and traditions of the church and its saints. Now introducing Jordan Burke.
Hey guys, it's good to be here. I'm very thankful that you guys offered me to come. I wish I could be there in person, as I was kind of saying before, but travel is kind of a mess. But yeah, so the title of my talk is called Shedding Blood, the Battle Plan for Overcoming Habitual Sin. And as a side note, everything that I'm talking about in this talk can be applied to any habitual sin. However, my primary focus, my ministry, is specifically focused towards men, towards overcoming pornography. That being said, just as it can help overcome any habitual sin, it can also help women as well. So that being said, in 2016, a study was sent across the nation in which it found that 64%, which is roughly 2/3 of US men, admitted to watching porn monthly. Another study showed that roughly 1/3 of all porn consumers are women. This is something that crosses both sexes. It's a plague in general. Porn consumption and its use have proven to have numerous neurological and psychological effects, from lowering gray matter and other dysfunctions. But as men and women of faith, we know that it is also a rot to our minds and, more importantly, our souls. It is contrary to how God has called us to live, and it is a chain wrapped tight, holding you back from becoming a saint. And I know that chain was very much wrapped around me for the better part of my life. I, however, have been blessed to spend endless hours with therapists and psychologists, some of the best in the nation, diving deep into my own struggles overcoming this addiction, thousands upon thousands of dollars, and well over a year of dedicated study into not just overcoming the addiction, but healing from it. So in this talk, I'm going to give you everything you need to understand, overcome, and begin to heal from this addiction. And if you're not suffering from it, you'll be able to serve somebody. Hopefully you'll be able to serve somebody who is. So first, let's start with the first of the three, which is understanding. And some of you who are listening may be a little bit confused. I keep using the word addiction when talking about pornography, and you may be asking yourself, well, wait a minute, can someone actually be addicted to porn? And despite attempts from those who are working in the industry to say otherwise, the answer is unequivocally and a resounding yes. And real quick before I continue, I'll give you a slight trigger warning for language. I know we all are adults, and I'm not going to say anything that's not written in the catechism, but for the sake of brevity, from here on out, you'll hear me use the phrase PMO, which stands for pornography, masturbation, and orgasm. But interestingly enough, each of those activities on their own can be addictive. However, during my studies of mentoring men, overcoming this addiction and going through this process, I found that, one may be addicted to one of the three and not necessarily the other, but most commonly, all three are involved in an incredibly powerful and destructive cocktail. So understanding why PMO is in fact addictive is key to overcoming it. We need to fully grasp the fact that this isn't just oh, hey, porn is bad, you need to stop watching it, you're committing mortal sin. But shifting the understanding that there's an actual neurological component to this battle, and you can't just snap your fingers and be done. It's not that easy. That's not how it works. And depending on how long you've been struggling in this battle, your body may actively be working against you because you've trained it to do so. So the human brain is an absolutely amazing organ in its function, what it's capable of, what it does for us on a daily basis, things we don't even have to think about. We are truly beautifully and wonderfully made. And to me, one of the more amazing things about the brain is despite its seemingly endless capabilities and functions, in a lot of ways, it's very simple, particularly when we're talking about addiction. So as it was mentioned, I was a police officer for a number of years. And one of the things you learn as a police officer is that people aren't necessarily addicted to a drug per se. They're addicted to the high. And then the drug is just the catalyst to that high. So what does that mean? Well, all drugs, while they all affect the body differently, crack affects differently than heroin, that sort of a thing, weed, uppers and downers, narcotics, those different things, they all share the same basic principle, and that is they interfere with the way that our neurons function. So more specifically, right now, we're talking about the part of our brain called the basal ganglia. Hang in there. I'm a nerd for this stuff, but I'm not going to nerd out on it because I know it's not interesting to everybody. But it's important to know. So the basal ganglia is the reward center of your brain. This is where we find the effect of a high when we engage in certain activities. And in the midst of that process, you'll hear this word come up a lot, dopamine. Now, dopamine is fascinating because for a long time, people thought that you can actually be addicted to dopamine, but more recent studies have come out that have shown it's more closely associated with the cycle of reward. So the reward cycle itself is incredibly important, which is why I added it in here, not to bore you guys or put you to sleep, but we'll get to that cycle shortly because it's its own section. But for the sake of understanding and brevity, dopamine is released in anticipation of certain action. So for instance, if you have like you love steak, like that is your favorite meal. If you were on death row and they're like, hey, what's the last thing you want to eat? You're the guy, you say, I want steak. While you're cooking the steak, you release dopamine. Why? Because your body is anticipating what it's going to take in. You can actually release dopamine in the store buying the steak because your body is still anticipating it. Your brain understands the cycle and the steps and what's going to happen next. And of course, we release dopamine at much higher levels with different activities. So that's why no matter how much you may love eating steak, and food addiction is a real thing as well, but it will never compare to drugs, sex, PMO. And to put that in perspective, a study was done back in 2010 where scientists found out that methamphetamine and sex flip the same switch in your brain. They fire a lot of the same neurons, not all the same neurons, but very close to the number of the same neurons, which is fascinating. So it's important to add that with the highs come the lows. PMO is closely linked to depression, anger, and anxiety. And why is that? Well, it's the same principle why you get a hangover when you drink too much. You've hotwired and hijacked your neurons. Your body is simply thrown out of whack, and it doesn't know necessarily how to recover in that moment. And the reason I bring that up is because when I'm mentoring guys, a lot of times they don't understand why they're so depressed after they've fallen. Of course, there's the aspect of, oh, I've sinned, I don't want to sin again. But you also have to understand that there's a neurological aspect. There's this high and this low. You're coming down. And when you're in that low, when you're coming off that high, that's a really great state to be in for the enemy to whisper in your ear and kick you while you're down. So that's really important to know. It's something that you have to keep in mind. It's not all, it is spiritual. It's certainly a spiritual battle, but it's also a physical and neurological battle. But understanding and defeating the physical will help lead you to victory and the spiritual. So one more note on the neurological side, and this is incredibly important. These highs and lows, these releases of chemicals, hijacking of neurons is also why porn use in particular, you'll find people viewing progressively more and more taboo and troubling things over time. I've heard from many people, women included, who say that they would never in a million years do or engage in what they're watching, but have to watch it or worse because it's the only way for them to experience the pleasure again. So that's very similar to drug use. Your body learns to adjust to the release of chemicals and tries to balance it out. That's why in drug cases we have overdoses. Unfortunately, in the case of PMO, rather than killing yourself or chasing a high and overdosing, you end up destroying relationships, families, people, and yourself. And this is one of the reasons it's particularly important to me. PMO in a big way played into why I ended up having to get a divorce. And so it's one of the things that kind of pushed me into this study, into this field of medicine. And it's why I fight so hard to help other people break free. So hopefully now we understand that PMO isn't just a fleeting thing, but it has a possibility and probability of becoming highly addictive. And now you might be saying, that's great, but sorry, hold on, I'm getting a lot of feedback. Let me go to my computer here. Okay. So you might be saying, okay, great. We understand it's addictive, neurons, addiction, cool. How do you overcome it? This is where the rubber meets the road. This is also where the beauty of our Catholic faith shines brightest. I am convinced that the only way to overcome this addiction is not just understanding the physiological and neurological processes, but utilizing that understanding and walking hand in hand with the sacraments and traditions of our faith. So again, perspective. AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, statistically has an astonishingly high failure and dropout rate. And that's not to say that they're not beneficial. Don't get me wrong. They are beneficial. But they are a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. The same goes for Sexaholics Anonymous, Lust Anonymous, even Celebrate Recovery, which is a Christian-based version that I do often recommend to people. But the church, on the other hand, Christ specifically is the great physician. True sobriety, true healing will only come through the church. And before I begin to start sounding like a televangelist, let's go ahead and talk about some practical steps. So I made a PDF that hopefully was handed out. If not, that's fine. Go ahead and it's called Shedding Blood and Immediate Action Plan. Has 5 steps on it. If you didn't get it, go ahead and go to do_the_harder thing on Instagram. That's my page. Shoot me a message and I'll send it to you. And I'll also answer any questions on there as well. And I have a lot of other resources on there as well. I'm not trying to promote my own junk, but if I want you to have access to this plan. So on this plan, I've listed 5 steps that you can take immediately to start breaking the chains. Now, I called it Shedding Blood for a reason, the name of the talk. Number 1, it's the title of the book I'm writing on this very topic. But number 2, Hebrews 12:4 says, in your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And I want you to think about that. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood. That is the standard. If you are not willing to fight to the point of shedding blood, you will not overcome this. I will never forget the time I was mentoring a group of young guys. I've been on like Twitter groups and support groups in person, all these other different groups. This was a Twitter group in particular, and there was a bunch of young guys, young, good Catholic guys who were really trying to help each other overcome it. And as a side note, community and accountability are a huge part of overcoming this as well. But that's a whole other talk. But keep in mind, community and accountability. So one day, one of the guys pops on there and he says, hey, look, I'm really struggling with temptation today. I'm afraid I'm going to slip up. Can you all pray for me? Good. Great. Yes, of course. Thank you for reaching out. And rightly so, all the other guys in the group started giving him advice. One guy says, hey, look, whenever I'm feeling tempted, I go running, like go jog around your house for a minute. Another guy says, hey, look, whenever I'm feeling tempted, I've found it beneficial to go read a book. And do you have like a book that you can jump into, a series you've been interested in, whatever. And advice after advice comes in and it's all right and it's all good. But his response to every one of them was, yeah, I really hate running. And I really hate reading. and just all these excuses after excuses for all these suggestions that were coming up. Now he's coming to us for help, as he should be. That's part of the process. But he wasn't willing to do what it took to beat that temptation. So I had to hop in there and I said, look, dude, flat out, it doesn't matter what you hate. And frankly, that's a weak excuse. If you're not willing to set aside your comfort, you're not willing to do what it takes to break free. What do you hate more, running or your temptation? You see, a large part of the saints, and what they talk about and what they have talked about for centuries is mastering our lower nature. And we will get more into that in step 4, but we need to lay the foundation of shedding blood. And that is what that is. Setting yourself aside in all possible ways, doing what you don't like to do in order to beat what is holding you down, in order to break the chains that are holding you down. The willingness to fight back no matter how uncomfortable it is. That is the foundation. And that is why that verse is so important to this whole thing. It is the foundation of everything. But into the steps. So step 1 through 5, and I've ordered them in a particular way, and we'll kind of get into why that is. Step 1 is to utilize blocking and accountability software. And notice that I said blocking and accountability. If you attempt to go at this on your own, you will end up deleting the software and falling into old habits. It happens every time, over and over and over again. Blocking software is almost useless in the long run if accountability is not involved. Accountability is a must. And if you don't know who to help you be accountable, hopefully you have a close friend. Some priests are willing to go out on a limb, because basically what happens is you receive an email if you slip up. If you view a site you're not supposed to, it sends an email to your accountability partner, and they're supposed to reach out to you and say, hey, what's going on? It's a step to remove the temptation. I had a priest once say to me, and I love this, I tell everybody this: if you really want to stop, if you really want to overcome this, make your mom your accountability partner. You'll stop real quick. And that's the entire point. So, for instance, I use a program called Covenant Eyes. I still use it to this day. By the grace of God, I have overcome this, which is why I'm here. But I still use that software. Why? Well, because I want that brick wall in my mind of, okay, I can't access it even if I wanted to. Even if I had the desire, there's no way that I can access it. It's on my phone, the computers in my house, everything I have. Covenant Eyes is a great software. And I still have several people who get reports to this day, making sure that I haven't messed up. And we check in on one another. Accountability and community, it's very, very important. This step, though, is the first step, because you cannot start healing from the drug if you're sitting next to the drug. It's almost the equivalent of like trying to have an AA meeting inside a brewery. Like it's counterproductive. It doesn't work. This step is the most basic step. It's the most simple step, and it is the step that I always, 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 always recommend first. Always. You have to remove the drug. If you still have access from it, you can't start healing. You can't start the healing process. It's not going to go well. Step 2. Out of all the steps, I would argue, and granted I'm biased because I made this, but I would argue that this is the most important step, because in this step you will find that you have your vision cleared. Right now you're on a battlefield and you're fighting in the fog. You're blind. You have no idea what's going to happen next, who's coming at you. You're mostly reactive. It's like the analogy I use is guys have these clenched fists, right? White knuckles, because they're waiting. Like, okay, when is temptation going to hit next? What's going to happen? They're going day by day on a reactive basis, hoping that nothing's going to happen. This step 2, helps you remove that fog, helps you to see the battlefield, so you're no longer on the defensive, but you can actively fight, right? We are the church militant. We're not called to stand back. We're called to fight. That's a whole other talk. So what are triggers, right? Because I'm telling you, figure out what your triggers are. What are triggers? Truthfully, triggers can be anything. Something you see visually just going through life. TV, movies, of course, whatever. It could be music, a particular song. It could be a person. It could be a certain time of day. You would be shocked at how many people I'm mentoring who have no clue, or they haven't clued into the fact until later on that, oh, hey, I'm always tempted at 8 o'clock at night. It's always 8 o'clock, or whatever the time is for whoever the person is. Even time of day can be a trigger. That goes back into the neurology, but we'll get into that in a moment. Actually, this is interesting. A colleague of mine who works with women through the same process of overcoming pornography, she just told me the other day, we were having a meeting, kind of trading notes, and she tells me women who are going through their cycle, that's actually a common trigger for them. So you can have natural triggers. And So what I did was I put what's most common on the card. HALT is the acronym: hungry, angry, lonely, tired. And bored is another common trigger, like you just have nothing to do. And I need to be clear, triggers in themselves are not always bad. Some are, some are not. Like for instance, probably shouldn't be watching Game of Thrones. If you know that there's some stuff in there, it's going to trigger you. That's a bad trigger. But obviously, we just talked about natural triggers. Triggers do not necessarily mean bad. It can be, not always the case. Just want to make that clear. I also want to make something else really clear that's along the same lines that a lot of people don't understand. And like there's a couple things, like you can throw out the rest of this talk, but there's like two things that I'd really want you to take away, and this is one of the two. Being tempted is not a sin. Temptation itself is not a sin. Giving in to the temptation is. Jesus was tempted in the desert. He wasn't sinning, he was tempted, right? Your response to the temptation is what matters. So giving into the temptation is the sin. The temptation itself is not the sin. This is how I put it to everybody. Every temptation is an opportunity to practice virtue. Every temptation is an opportunity to practice virtue. Remember that, please. So that way, scrupulosity sucks. So remember, every temptation is not sin. It's an opportunity to practice virtue. Back into the triggers. This whole step relies on self-knowledge. It's heavily based on the psychological and neurological functions that we opened up with. And I'll just give you a story as an example. Let's just say we have a guy named Jim. Jim is in college, works hard at his job, works hard at his studies. He also has a PMO problem. It's very common. He's been fighting for a long time. And most days he's totally fine, which is great. But he falls every once in a while and he just can't seem to shake the habit. So Jim reaches out for advice. And after I kindly chastise him for not having blocking software, again, first easiest step, I ask him to walk me through his day. Right? This is the common practice. What happened during your day? Give me the rundown. Jim proceeds to tell me he's pretty stressed out. He has exams coming up. He tells me that his boss at work is kind of a jerk. We've all experienced this. And the day that he fell into temptation, his boss had berated him, right? So his emotions were really high. So he came home, he was stressed out, trying to relax. He sits on his couch, starts scrolling through Instagram, sees an image on a fitness account he follows. Okay, pause for effect. Everyone knows what I'm talking about. He scrolls past it, but that image remains in his head, right? He continues through his night, but that image keeps pulling at him. And next thing you know, he's slipped up and he's given in to the temptation. So if I was there in person, I'd ask for hands raised. But what do you think his triggers were? Well, obviously, the most obvious one, the first one, is the fitness account, right? And the one he probably shouldn't have been following in the first place. But truthfully, when you go back and you understand the neurological process, he was primed to slip way before he saw that picture. Stressed out, tired, frustrated, all of these are triggers, right? These are precursors. If you think of it, the triggers are the fuel, and the image was the spark that lit the fire, right? So now what I'm about to say is really important. Bear with me here. Jim's homework now, the homework I give him, is to look back on every time he slipped up and that he can try to remember and try to find a pattern. And after some digging, he does find a pattern. On the days that he's stressed, angry, frustrated, whatever, he slips. He also realizes he only slips right before bedtime. And why is that? Because he's in his bed scrolling through Instagram on his phone. Here's the linchpin to the entire trigger system. This is where neurons come back into play with our buddy dopamine. You got to understand this. Jim created what we call in the industry, it's called a habit loop, right? He has a hard day, tries to distract himself, and ends up training his body to betray him. And I know I'm jumping ahead a little bit. Jim's body, whenever it feels stress or frustration, seeks to remedy the situation. Every single one of us does this, right? That's why what's the most common one, right? Like chocolate, ice cream. Like you're seeking to remedy these chemical reactions in your body, the stress, all this kind of stuff. But the problem is when you're entering into that reward system, that habit loop system, you're triggering the dopamine. And if you choose to medicate, it's really not even self-medication, it's self-inebriation. If you choose to inebriate yourself with PMO, you're overdosing your body with that dopamine response, right? And what happens is now your body is on autopilot. You've created, truthfully, a subconscious cycle that you'll engage in. This is habitual mortal sin. That's why people are like, I don't understand why I can't overcome this. Well, because it is, like I said, it is a spiritual battle, and we're getting into that. But it is also very much a physiological and neurological and a psychological battle. You have to break that habit loop that you've created. The good news is that habit loops can be changed really, really easily. This is why learning your triggers is so important, because now, like I said, you can see the battlefield, you can see the cycle you're in. I believe the non-PMO version is like cue, trigger, reward. In PMO or in the overcoming pornography circles, we usually say trigger, fantasy, and then acting out, right? And you don't ever want to get to the acting out stage. That's the sin part of the stage. That's the cycle that we're talking about. So Jim knows now that on days when he finds himself particularly stressed, his trigger, he needs to go to the gym, work off the energy, and as an added safety measure, maybe even leave his phone in his car overnight to remove the temptation completely, right? Remember, temptation to virtue. He does this over and over, and not only has he created a new healthy habit, but he has a better understanding of himself, and he's removed the trigger for the enemy to poke and use against him. Okay. Now, for those who do not know your triggers, you can easily find them out, kind of how I described. And this is the more intensive process. This is the one that I went through, and it was shocking and blew my mind. But if you want to do it the hard way, which I do recommend, you can easily find out your triggers by going back and analyzing your slip ups in excruciating, agonizing detail. And I mean excruciating. I'm talking like step by step, like how many sites did you click? How long were you on a particular website? What happened directly before? Where were you? It's a deep dive into details. It's not fun. It's really painful, but it's effective, because what you think is, oh, I was tempted and I slipped up. It's not a two-step process. You'll find out that there was 62 steps between temptation and slipping up. And somewhere in there, or rather, you had 62 opportunities for virtue, right? That's how that works. But if you don't feel like doing that because it is intense, this is the other way that I recommend that is also very highly effective. I learned this back a while back studying habit loops and that psychology there. And basically, every time you're tempted, if you can recognize it, and recognizing, by the way, is a process in and of itself. It's something that you have to learn and grow with. So just pray for clarity there. But when you find yourself tempted, when you recognize that, stop whatever you're doing and write down 3 things. And it could be any of the following. What are you feeling? Where are you? What were you doing before you got tempted? What will you do to seek virtue? And what's beautiful about this is it's not only effective in helping you recognize trends and helping you recognize triggers, but the very action of stopping and analyzing yourself is sometimes enough to snap you out of that temptation, to break you out of that subconscious loop. And to be clear, you cannot rely solely on this to overcome in this battle, but it is a powerful tool to help you through the process. This third step, and this would seem fairly obvious, is the sacraments, right? Confession, reconciliation, the Eucharist, as much as humanly possible. Like this is actually another thing my colleague said when she's talking about helping women. One of the ways that she overcame was going to daily mass, receiving the Eucharist daily. Like she told me, she's like, that's what gave me the power to do it. She said, there's times where I know that I still have to do it, or else I'm gonna, that's the only thing that's keeping me away from the edge. So the sacraments. But as I mentioned before, I ordered this in a particular way, and you might think that this should have been first. It's third for a reason. While there is immense power provided to you through the sacraments, we know this, we should know this, to help you overcome whatever you're struggling with, you have to have first a firm purpose of amendment. And this is where it gets serious. And the only reason I'm getting serious is because I've noticed a trend recently that's really disturbing, and it's heartbreaking more than anything. And I don't want any of you listening to go through this. You must understand that if you are falling and going to confession over and over again, but not taking any steps to overcome, you're abusing the confessional. So Pope John Paul II in 1996 wrote a letter to a cardinal on confession in which he states, and I quote, "It is also self-evident that the accusation of sins must include the serious intention not to commit them again in the future. If this disposition of soul is lacking, there is really no repentance. This is, in fact, a question of moral evil as such, and so not taking a stance opposed to a possible moral evil would mean not detesting evil and not repenting. In layman's terms, if you are not taking serious steps to overcome the sin, like you keep falling but don't have blocking software, then you're not actually repenting. And if you're not actually repenting, is your confession even valid? And the answer is no. The church is clear and firm on her teachings about reconciliation. And this is why I've listed it as the third step, because the first two steps are easy and active ways for you to have a firm purpose of amendment. I don't want you to get caught up in that cycle. And I'm not here to chastise you, just to be clear. I'm hoping that saying that doesn't come off as a chastisement, but rather lights a fire underneath you, right? And hopefully helps set you free. And in the course, of sharing this truth, we need to understand what that truth really is. I don't want people cheating themselves. I often refer to it as you're playing Russian roulette with your soul and you're going to lose every time. So, step 4. It is often misunderstood, mortification, but incredibly powerful. And this step is deeply rooted in wisdom, tradition, and physical action of the saints. At a base level, we have story after story of saint throwing himself into thorn bushes, right? Throwing himself into an icy, I think it was St. Francis. I believe it was Augustine who threw himself into a thorn bush. And then I believe it was St. Francis who threw himself into an icy pond. There's numerous stories, right? But they did it in order to keep themselves from falling into temptation. They truly understood the concept of resisting to the point of shedding blood. And though I would never prescribe to somebody to jump into a thorn bush, no matter how effective that may be, there are many other equally efficacious ways to mortify yourself. So the entire concept and process of mortification is to make your lower nature, your body, a slave to you, rather than you being a slave to it, right? And other outside impulses. On the handout, I wrote, deny yourself as often as possible. That's mortification. On a simple note, driving home, really craving Taco Bell, deny yourself. I know how good the $5 menu is right now. I get it. Deny yourself. Go eat at home. That's mortification. Taking cold showers, that's mortification. Fasting is the most common form of mortification, not just refraining from meat on Fridays, mind you, but maybe one day a week you go on just bread and water to offer up, one day a week you go out on bread and water and you offer up your discomfort as reparation for past sins and to strengthen you to avoid sinning in the future. That's mortification. No thorn bushes are needed, right? Unless you really feel like going and truly emulating the saints. We are called to emulate the saints, but I'm not throwing myself in a thorn bush. I hate cold showers too, so I'm just putting that out there, but they work. So it should be noted that we're called to do this anyway. We're called to mortification anyway. It's written in scripture, church history, and tradition. Now, understand that this is a process, right? I didn't say mortify when tempted. I said mortify as much as possible. And I want to touch briefly on what proper mortification looks like, because this is another something that pops up that seems to cause a lot of confusion and it doesn't need to. But this in particular, what I'm about to say, is the question I get all the time. First and foremost, prayer is not mortification, okay? Ever. Prayer is never mortification. I had someone come to me once and say that they were praying the rosary as an act of mortification. That's not right. That's not how it works, okay? Prayer is never mortification. Hammer that in your brains. However, if you decide to pray the rosary on your knees, denying yourself the comfort of a chair — I have hardwood floors, that would not be pleasant — that would be an act of mortification. So the prayer itself is not the mortification, but there's actually lots of church teaching and tradition called pious kneeling. If you ever happen to catch me at Mass, you'll notice that I never use the kneeler. Why? Because that's a way that I know that I can consistently practice mortification, self-denial. And I go to the Latin Mass, so there's a lot of kneeling. Anyway, going to the gym, not mortification, okay? Unless you struggle with sloth. So hopefully you see where I'm going here, right? When you think mortification, we're not thinking whipping ourselves We're talking denial of self. Mortification is denial of self. I want to do this, but instead I'm going to do this, or whatever is more difficult, or whatever you may not like. It is the entire reason my ministry is called Do the Harder Thing, because you always need to do the harder thing. Finally, the last step, is prayer. Last step is prayer. As I mentioned in the handout, none of this matters. Steps 1 through 4 mean nothing, or rather, let me rephrase, they are not as efficacious as they could be if you're not seeking a personal relationship with Christ daily. Prayer is the fuel to this fire, and without it, you'll be sorely lacking in what you need to prevail in battle. Only through prayer will you gain the self-knowledge needed, the instances of pause and reflection. Your body, your very brain, the outside world especially is working against you. Prayer is the antidote to that onslaught. So, as I explained mortification, some of you may be wondering, okay, what does prayer look like in this context specifically? First and foremost, you should be praying the rosary daily. Easy, accessible, powerful. I was nodding my head. I'm so pumped I saw you guys are doing the Marian consecration in 33 days. Highly recommend it. Like you guys are going to love it. You're going to take off like a rocket ship. It's such good spiritual fuel. Praying the rosary daily. Secondly, I always recommend a nightly examination of conscience, and that may sound complicated, but it's incredibly simple. So a good friend of mine, Father John Bartunek, describes it as taking a helicopter up like 20,000 feet or so and going back over your day, like being up in the helicopter and watching yourself through your day, asking specifically and looking specifically for areas or instances in which you could have done better, but more importantly, also taking time to realize the times that you did well and blessed. I mentioned it in the very beginning of this whole talk, but shame is a powerful weapon that the enemy uses to bring us down. When we engage in prayer like this, recognizing the blessings that God has given us despite our failures, we start to break the shame, and it no longer becomes a tool or an option used against us. So recognize the good. I also highly suggest you meditate on who God says that you are. So I have a video out on my YouTube page. It's also called Do the Harder Thing. And it's about like 20 or 30 verses directly from Scripture, directly from God, that says who you are and who you are called to be. This is a powerful prayer and meditation because so often, we're suffering from these different identity wounds that feed into this PMO habit. And I've said this so many times now, but that's a whole nother talk. There are many ministries focused just on that identity healing. It's really important. So that's another big recommendation. And another one I would recommend is what's called Lectio Divina. Hopefully you're familiar with that. Basically, loosely translated to divine reading. And this is just a practice of taking a portion of the gospel, slowly reading it, and asking God to reveal what he wants you to know about it. I myself, I'll often try to put myself in the scene, in what I'm reading, like meditating on the words and listening, but trying to really imagine myself standing there. Can I feel the gravel under my feet? Like, what am I hearing? What can I feel? What's the weather like? Am I experiencing this? What is the presence of Christ in this? But I'm also ADD. So, so if you have trouble focusing like I do, I really recommend the book called The Better Part. That's also by Father John Bartunek. And he walks through all the Gospels and kind of does the reflection for you. It's really powerful stuff. So those are the 5 steps. And the final thing I promised you in this talk, understanding, overcoming, and healing is the healing process. And I've been blessed to go to some incredible, incredible healing retreats. And I'm more than happy to recommend them. Healing the Whole Person by Dr. Bob Schutz, a personal hero of mine that I had the honor to speak alongside, so to speak, at the Virtual Catholic Conference. That blew my mind. So unworthy, with other amazing, incredible speakers. But he's out of the JP2 Center for Healing. Healing the Whole Person is amazing. Catholic Unbound is also very beneficial. But I'm going to let you all in on the big secret, right? This entire process, the 5 steps that I've given you, this whole thing, the entirety of this journey is your healing. In fact, not by my doing it all, but through the infinite wisdom of our merciful God, you cannot avoid healing while going through this process. It's so deeply intertwined that it will start to happen whether you realize it or not. As long as you're willing to do what it takes. As long as you're willing to shed blood. as long as you're willing to do the harder thing. And that, my friends, is all I got. Thank you so much for listening. I pray that this serves you all in some way. And if you want to get in touch with me, again, my Instagram is the easiest way to get in touch with me. It's do_the_harder thing. I'll be happy to talk to anyone at any time. My DMs are always open. And if I understand correctly, I think we have some questions. Yes? Maybe.
Yes. Awesome. So,
Hold on, I'm not hearing you. Let's see.
oh, okay.
Oh, I can hear you now.
Awesome. Is it working now?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay. Thank you so much, Jordan. Yes, we do have time for questions. So as always, we're going to have a 3-minute break, and please send us your questions in the Google form. This is anonymous, so when you put them in, I won't say your name. Your name doesn't even come up. Completely anonymous. So we'll be back in a few minutes with your questions, and thank you so much. Okay, and we're back. Like I said before, thank you so much. I think that this is an epidemic that isn't talked about enough. And so all of the advice that you're giving us and your personal experience, like it's, I just know it's going to go so far. So thank you. And we have a bunch of questions here, which is awesome. So we're going to start with, do you have any Bible verses that help you when you're looking for inspiration in overcoming sin, or maybe that motivate or inspire?
Yeah, so my memory is terrible, but the one that I mentioned in this, I believe it's Hebrews 12:4. the battle against sin. That one always struck me just because it's so clear. Like there's no ambivalence there. There's no way that you can interpret it any other way than if you're going to battle, if you're going to overcome, then you need to be willing to shed blood. And what does that look like? That's my go-to. That's the one that I always go to, that I keep really close to my heart. There's a few others, but a lot of the ones. So what's interesting is in your journey, whoever is going through this, overcoming this, it is going to be personal. The advice is a lot of the same, but you should understand that there are going to be different things that reach out to you in different ways. And a lot of my healing personally had to do with identity. So my verses were all identity based, which is why I created that video. So I don't remember them. I'm so sorry. I don't remember them all off the top of my head. But if anybody is curious, like I said, I think it's like 20 or 30 of them in that video.
Oh, wow, that's awesome.
So yeah, so there's a lot there.
Awesome. Wow, thank you so much. And I think that's one of the things that struck me the most. There was a lot, but that was one of them. When you just very clearly stated it. Yeah, whoever you is, me, everyone else, like we have not resisted to the point of shedding blood. And that is a sobering thought. I mean, with any sins that we're struggling with, we can always try harder and rely on God's grace more. But something that kind of, I don't know, a thought I had listening to that is, what do you do if you just feel like you don't have the motivation to try that hard?
That's a good question. That's a really good question. I actually haven't had that come across. I haven't come across that yet. I would imagine if I had a guy come up to me and said he didn't have the motive, and you know what? That's not true. I have had that question. I asked them what's going on in their process and why don't they want to fight, right? Because we understand we're all faithful. We all understand what this means. Like I hammered the neurological and psychological and physiological aspects of it, but this is primarily a faith-based issue. I don't want to die in a state of mortal sin. We all know what that means. And so my question would be, if you don't have the motivation, like, do you understand what Christ did for you on the cross? Like, do you fully understand that? Like, go pray the sorrowful mysteries. Go really meditate on that. Go watch the Passion, the scourging at the pillar. Like, if that's not motivation, I don't know what is. And if that doesn't motivate you, then there might be something else there. And I don't want to come off as chastising. There is obviously, like I said, there's chemical aspects to this. And sometimes someone may just have a chemical imbalance. We don't know. But the first part of that, I think, is probably the more common response.
Right, yes. And yeah, I think that's just really good advice in general, to just have a heart-to-heart with God. And even asking him, like, Lord, please help me to have sorrow for my sins, and for that motivation to overcome. Another question, how do we have patience with ourselves or our loved one, but still challenge ourselves or our loved one in this process of recovery?
For sure. So two different things. It's actually one of the reasons why, well, one, the neurology is so important because that's integral to the process. But I also found that when you explain to these guys, and I would assume it's the same with women, but I work with men only. When you explain to them, hey, you need to understand that this is a neurological process that you're fighting against. It isn't just you. So many these guys say, like, I'm just a loser. I'm like, no, dude, like you're struggling. We all struggle. You're just having to struggle a little bit more than some other people. Like you're fighting your body. You can overcome it, but that's what you're fighting. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of hope. And then I also hope that that gives some people from the outside looking in some understanding into the process as well. Like I said in the talk, like you can't just snap your fingers and be done with this, right? Like this is something you have to constantly fight through. And then there was a second part, but it completely slipped my mind. I apologize.
Oh yeah, no, totally fine. The second part is, so that was the patience part, but then also having patience, but still challenging ourselves, like kind of that line.
Yeah, scrupulosity is tough. It's tough for everybody, but it seems to be something that really pops up in this struggle in particular. And it's just a constant reminder that God has called us to more, right? Like I mentioned, like we're the church militant, but every one of us has a mission and every one of us has a vocation and missions within that vocation. And like, okay, are we striving for that? Okay, I want to fulfill that. Like this kind of stuff, like I'm exhausted. I had my little girl before this. I love her to death, but she wears me out, right? She's 2 years old. She runs all over. And she's gorgeous, but she wears me out. But this stuff, like I'm energized. Like this pumps me up. So you can have these times where it's like, okay, I'm tired, I'm sad, I'm depressed. I don't think I have the motivation to go on. But if you focus on, but God's called me to more. I'm called to more. I can do more. I could be a saint, right? Like that's something that can really help motivate and carry through these moments where we just don't know if we can keep pulling forward.
Wow, I love that. It reminded me, I don't remember if it's St. Paul that says this, probably. But with every temptation that God allows us to experience, He also gives us everything that we need to overcome
Yep.
it. That just, it comforts me a lot because, I mean, God cannot lie. So if He says that, it must be true all the time. So it's like in those moments where you're thinking to yourself, okay, there's no way that I can do this. You know that that's a lie. It's
Yep.
just a
Exactly.
straight up lie.
Exactly.
Because every situation you're in where there's a temptation, you know beyond a shadow of doubt that you have what you need to overcome it.
Precise. It's grace sufficient to the day. Like you nailed it. That's so dead on accurate.
Yeah, so I just think that's something that we need to soak in daily, just that truth. Another question, what is the role of counseling in this process, and do you recommend that people get counseling for this healing?
Yes and no. So it's totally dependent on the person, and it's totally dependent on your journey in life and how deeply you are battling, these hills and valleys, or how deeply you're going through these hills and valleys. I went through, as I kind of mentioned, absurd amounts of counseling, of clinics, of therapy. But I'm the kind of guy that if I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it to its fullest extent. Like when I was a police officer, I wasn't just a police officer. Like I was doing everything, like quick
That's
response team,
awesome.
field training officer, like all that's yeah. So that's my mentality. Like if I'm gonna beat this, I'm gonna beat it. Counseling is super beneficial, and I want people to understand that. Especially, and here's what I would recommend. Actually, here's what I would recommend: get a spiritual director. If you don't have a spiritual director, you need one, and they will help you determine whether or not you need to seek further counseling.
Mm.
That's the key. The spiritual life, understanding that and having your spiritual life base. It's like I said, prayer, without prayer, none of this matters. Same with your spiritual life. So I would recommend getting a spiritual director, and then they can help you understand whether or not you actually need a counselor.
That's really good advice because your spiritual director should know you pretty well, and
Mm-hmm.
in that way they give you what's unique to you. Thank you. Um, Another question. So you mentioned in your talk the abuse of the sacrament of confession, um, and
Mm-hmm.
I think that's even something that I remember when I was younger. I would think to myself like, well, if God's gonna forgive me, like it's fine. And just this laxness. So okay. You said that. What would you recommend to someone that heard that and realizes, oh my gosh, this is what I'm doing? How do you move forward from that?
It's just that firm purpose of amendment. Like that's all it is. I mean, we say it in when we're done. I promise to avoid the. I'm totally screwing it up. I've been to confession so many times. I should have this memorized. But but it says in there, and avoid the near occasion of sin. That's talking about that firm purpose of amendment, and that's why I put the first step, get blocking for this in particular. If you're struggling with this in particular, your firm purpose of amendment could be this easy: go out and get blocking software, and then you can go with a clear conscience and say, okay, I took a step. I'm paying monthly. And then, but here's the thing: if you fall again, what's the next step? And honestly, it comes to the person and their journey, right? And it may be something as simple as, and I'm just throwing ideas out here, leaving your phone in the car. Like I knew a guy who had to do that. I broke, true story. When this was years ago. I had a tablet and I was tempted, and I literally broke the tablet over my knee.
That's
In the
awesome.
in the midst of my struggle, I was like, and I cracked, which was a terrible idea because there was like little pieces of glass everywhere. It was a nightmare. But
That's
that's a firm purpose of
dedication.
amendment.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, right, right. Firm purpose of amendment. It could be as simple as leaving your phone in the car. It could be as simple as chucking your phone out the window. As long as you're taking active steps, think of it this way. You're going to have to stand before God one day. Can you stand before him and say, and I'm actually getting emotional thinking about this, I did everything I possibly could. Like, my hands are clean. I did everything I knew to do. That's a firm purpose of amendment.
Wow. So that actually, I think that might answer one of the questions that we got. What's the most extreme measure you took during this fight?
Breaking a tablet over my knee.
That's incredible. Wow. Yeah, so that's how far we need to go, people. How do we try to fight this addiction if we have a difficult relationship with God, or maybe a distant relationship with God, or no relationship with God?
Yeah, you have to. So something that was really helpful for me in the beginning was learning in particular my relationship with three persons of God: God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. And it was a fascinating journey because I realized that my relationship with Jesus may have been good, God the Son, but with God the Father, there was something lacking there. And then that goes into something different, like, okay, well, how do I look at a relationship as a father? My daughter, I've been meaning to do a video on this, I just haven't had time, but she has taught me more about the love of God than I probably would have ever learned on my own. For instance, she's just learning to talk. She's talking way better now, but she still has like words that make no sense. It's just made up. But she comes to me and she says these made up words, and I'm sitting there and I'm like, yeah, keep talking. Like, this is great. Keep talking. Okay. I'm a broken human being. I'm a broken, sinful human being. But I love her that much and I want to hear her talking. Okay. So what does that mean about God the Father? Like, how much more? He's perfect. How much more does he want to hear us talk to him? Like, that yearning is there. We're made after his image. So take that feeling I'm feeling and multiply it by 1,000,000,000. You know what I mean? Like that. And it probably doesn't even come close to what he's experiencing. So that sort of a thing is what I would recommend, going through that journey and trying to understand, like, okay, what is my relationship with God? What does this look like? How do I make this personal? And of course, always like just studying the scriptures and studying the lives of the saints. I mean, I'm so blessed that I get paid to do the Saints and Sages podcast. It's absurd that that's part of my job, Saints and Sages podcast, learning the lives of the saints.
Wow.
And gleaming all this information from them and learning from their love and their journey with Christ and how they related to him. So those are the kind of things I'd recommend for that.
Wow.
Hopefully that answers the question. I'm not sure.
Yes. This is a big question. We got a lot of people asking this. How do we accompany a significant other in PMO? And at what point does PMO become a deal breaker?
So it becomes a deal breaker when they don't break it, right? It's easy enough. If they are not, you can think of it in the same way as we were talking about confession. If you're watching them, human beings are simple. We have trends. We have trends of success or we have trends of failure. And if we're not making a firm purpose of amendment to overcome, then that should be a sign to you to say, okay, I probably need to take a step back from this. As far as how to help them through this, understanding and support, and I use that word carefully. Obviously, you don't want to support the bad habits, but not breaking them down and saying like, I can't believe you did this again. Like, you're such a bad person. It's more of a, okay, you fell, you screwed up. I get it. This is tough. Okay, what can I do to help you? What do you need to overcome this? Because ultimately, if you're in a relationship, let's say parents, like, my job as a father is to make sure that my daughter becomes a saint and gets to heaven. So I'm not gonna beat her down and berate her and say, why did you fail? I'm gonna say, how can I help you? How can I help you? Which is, by the way, relationship with Christ, right? He's doing the same thing. How can I help you? How can I help you? Just that support and understanding is really beneficial. That being said, if you are in a relationship, I want to let you know, I know your pain, and I understand the hardships that you're going through. Do not deny yourself the pain that you're going through. Experience that pain, let it out, but don't allow your pain to dictate your thinking and behavior towards the person that you're supposed to be loving. And that's all I'll kind of say on that.
Awesome. Um, what risks might this pose to a future family or future relationships, or the way that you see yourself if it's not broken?
Cool. This is easy. I'm divorced. Didn't want it. Horrific. Like I said, I have a little girl, and I have to deal with that process. I have to deal with that fact. And the church does not like divorce, right? So this is not an easy thing. It's very painful, right? It will end relationships. It will end relationships. Another thing, that's a personal aspect. Another part of it is it will change the way that you view other people. Like I have so many guys, I had to go through it myself actually in the very beginning, and so many guys now, they'll tell you, I started viewing women as objects. That's how I viewed them. That is so, it breaks my heart now that I'm, by the grace of God, I'm past this and I understand it. But it still breaks my heart when I hear somebody else say that they're going through that, because I know that it's not an active choice for them to view someone else in that way, right? This is the work of the devil. Of course, the devil takes everything we have. If you're familiar with Screw Tape Letters, by the way, if you haven't read Screw Tape Letters, read Screw Tape Letters.
Yes.
What's his primary? Thank you. What's his primary thing that he does? Takes the good and twists it, right? So he takes beauty and he twists it. He takes love and he twists it. He takes sex and he twists it. He takes relationship and he twists it, right? That's what we're dealing with. It will twist your viewpoint of everything. Not to mention, on a more practical note, like I said, depression, anxiety, this addiction. The more, and then on a spiritual note, the more that you allow yourself to become a slave to your lower nature, the more you'll find yourself falling in other areas. So often PMO will lead to alcoholism. It will lead to actually more. I was working with a guy who ended up he ended up divorced, but because he was engaging with prostitutes, right? So that was the ramp up for him. So it's just this dark, twisted, like it's a black hole really, and the opportunities of pain are endless. And then also, with that being said, and I didn't talk about it here, but I did a whole series of it on my Instagram. You got to understand that the quote unquote porn industry, 9 out of 10 things that you are seeing are either forced, coerced, drugs, sex trafficking. That's a huge one. I've been working with, or I've been supporting Fight the New Drug and Exodus Cry, two great people. And then there's one other that I'm forgetting. But the point of the matter is, none of it is, or very little of it is voluntary. And do you think the ones who are quote unquote voluntary are really voluntary? It's like, so what's more likely? You're more likely, truthfully and statistically, to be supporting sex trafficking than you are to be just, I'm just watching porn, if that makes sense. So I know I kind of went off on a little bit of a tangent there, but that also is a negative aspect of not breaking this habit.
Yes, and that that also answers a question we got from someone asking for an approach to helping people outside of the church who don't see the dangers of PMO. And that I just learned that a few weeks ago. Just that when we watch these things, I mean, this is like people becoming slaves
Yes.
and feeding into that business. Which is just, it's so heartbreaking and terrifying. And I just appreciate so much your bluntness in saying what you did, because I think even just hearing it, it's just like, whoa, the weight of the matter just got even more. Okay,
Well,
a couple more questions.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Sorry. So to answer specifically to help people outside the church, go to fightthenewdrug.org. They're a non-religious, non-political organization, and they have which is the beauty there. I wish it was religious, but the beauty for them doing that is that they can step back and say, "Hey, we have no agenda. We're just bringing the facts." And they list out all those facts. They talk about the sex trafficking. They talk about the other effects. They have all the statistics. So if you're trying to help somebody who is non-religious, that's a fantastic resource to give to them to kind of understand the detriment that PMO causes.
Awesome. Can you just say the name of that website one more time
Yeah,
and
yeah.
we'll link it?
So Fight the New Drug, and I believe it's .org.
Okay, perfect. We've got that linked. Yeah, awesome. Okay, just a couple more questions. What is the name of the blocking software that we can use?
So I use Covenant Eyes. I really like them. They were actually, funny enough, they were involved with the Virtual Catholic Conference. I don't know to what extent. So I don't think they come out. I don't know if they're openly a Catholic company, but I think they might be. I don't know. I hope they don't hate me for saying
I
that.
think
But
they are, because
yeah.
I've heard it on Matt Fradd's show,
Yes.
so I think so.
Yeah. So I really like them. It's the best that I've found that truly does catch stuff. It really does send out reports for accountability built in. I know there's some other stuff like Fortify, Blocked is I think is one, but I honestly, all those aside, I do truly recommend Covenant Eyes. That's the one that I'm most familiar with. There may be something better, but that's what I'm most familiar with.
Awesome, awesome, yes. And any advice on how to find a spiritual director? This person is an adult in a community, and they've gone to local priests from the parish, but none of them do spiritual direction.
So funny enough, and this is not technically my area of expertise, but I am blessed to work with some of the greatest theological minds in the nation as my day job. Spiritualdirection.com, and I believe that there's an area on that site where you can look for how to find a spiritual director, and it will give you all the information you need. Another really good resource is a book called Navigating the Interior Life that breaks it down as well. A lot of people don't know that lay people can actually be spiritual directors. And there's one more, oh gosh, Heart of the Carrot, Heart of the, they're gonna hate me for forgetting their name. I think it's Heart of Christ, Heart of Carrot. My day job also is involved in a school that trains spiritual directors. So spiritualdirection.com, there's resources, and then even actually Apostole Via, and I'll spell that APOSTOLIVIAE.org. There is a ton of spiritual directors on there. That's a community. It's a religious community, but that's where the spiritual directors kind of come out of. So.
Wonderful. That is so helpful, and we're putting all of those in our comments section.
Awesome.
Our last question. At what point do you know you're healed?
In the healing community, we say you're never healed until you're standing in front of Christ. Right? It's just that simple. If it's not PMO, it's identity. If it's not identity, it's some other struggle. And I don't want that to sound like it's this disheartening thing. It's actually a beautiful thing. I mean, we're told, Jesus makes it very clear, in order to follow him, we have to pick up our cross, and nothing about carrying the cross is easy, right? Nothing about it. We know the 12 stations of the cross, I think it's 12. Yeah, 12 stations. Sorry, I'm tired now. The stations of the cross, right? We know the journey that is and the difficulty there. And so you're healed when you're standing in front of Christ, but it's a constant, beautiful journey. And I hate to use this imagery, but just imagine you're turning into a butterfly. You're coming out of that sack thing, and you're a butterfly.
That's beautiful. I love it. Wow. And I think it's just so good to keep in mind that the Lord is always trying to heal us and cleanse us and make us beautiful, and the devil's always trying to sabotage that. And I love what you brought up earlier with, like, he hates beautiful things. So good relationships, good marriages, anything that's good, he's going to try and destroy it. So yes, we need to be on guard. And this talk tonight was just so, so powerful for all of us with that. So thank you so much. And John is going to come give some closing announcements. So off to you.
Yeah, thank you. All right. Jordan, thank you so much again. That was amazing.
It was my pleasure. My pleasure.
All right. So for our events, okay. Oh my gosh, I almost lost it. All right. So tonight at 9, we'll be doing a Thursday night comp line. The Zoom code will be down below. And for next week's speaker, we will be having Brenda Sorto speaking on The Feminine Genius by St. John Paul II. Other than that, if you want to share this with your friends, feel free to do so. Be sure to like and subscribe, do all that stuff, and I'll see you guys next week. Have a good one.